The strange thing about that night wasn't how brightly the chandeliers sparkled above the velvet-draped ballroom, or how the champagne seemed to flow endlessly into crystal flutes held by manicured hands. It was how quickly a single laugh could cut through all of it, sharp enough to silence a dream before it had the chance to breathe. I'll never forget the sound, the way Edward Kingsley's mocking chuckle bounced off those marble columns and made heads turn, as though cruelty itself had been invited to take center stage. If you've ever known what it feels like to be dismissed before you've spoken, laughed at before you've even begun, then you'll understand why I'm telling you this story. And if you agree that voices like ours deserve to be heard, then take a moment to like this story, subscribe for more, and join me as I walk you through the night that changed everything. The gala had been billed as the event of the season, a celebration of literature's elite, hosted in the gilded heart of Manhattan at the Metropolitan Hall, where the city's oldest publishing dynasties brushed shoulders with the young hopefuls who longed for nothing more than to be seen. I remember arriving with my manuscript tucked carefully in my bag, pages worn at the edges from nervous rereading, my palms damp with the kind of fear that smells faintly of ink and ambition. My name was not yet known to anyone in that realm, but in my chest it burned like a secret. Danielle Carter, daughter of a schoolteacher and a postal worker from Atlanta, a woman who had wrestled her way through rejection letters and sleepless nights to shape a book out of fragments of pain, history, and hope. I had imagined the moment 1,000 different ways, approaching Kingsley, the titan of publishing, whose magazine, the Kingsley Review, could make or break an author's career. I pictured him leaning forward as I spoke, intrigued, his sharp blue eyes softening as he recognized something undeniable in my words. But reality, I would soon learn, had no intention of being kind. When I first spotted him across the ballroom, he was already holding court, surrounded by an orbit of admirers, young writers desperate for validation, critics hoping for a quote they could use in print, and investors who treated culture like a stock portfolio. He looked every inch the patrician king of words, silver hair swept back, a tailored navy suit that whispered old money, and a glass of scotch in his hand as though it had grown there. I waited for my chance, heart pounding, until he glanced toward me with that peculiar half-smile that could either open doors or slam them shut. "You there," he said, his voice smooth yet weighted with arrogance. "You look as if you've got something to say. Come on, let's hear it. Everyone loves a good story." The circle around him quieted, expectant, their polished shoes shifting on the parquet floor as they turned toward me. It should have been the beginning of a conversation, but what followed instead was the slow unraveling of a young woman's dignity. I introduced myself, voice steady despite the way my stomach twisted, and offered him my manuscript as though handing over a piece of my soul. He took it with exaggerated delicacy, pinching the pages between his fingers as though the ink itself might stain his skin. "Carter," he mused, drawing out the syllables as though tasting something sour. "And from where did you spring up, Miss Carter?" "Atlanta," I replied, hoping the steadiness in my tone would mask the tension coiling inside me. That's when the first laugh came, not from him, but from someone in the crowd, a brittle little chuckle that hinted at what was to follow. Kingsley smirked. "Atlanta," he repeated, as if it were a punchline. "I suppose next you'll tell me your great literary training came from." "What? A blog? A local book club?" The words landed with a force I hadn't expected, drawing another ripple of laughter from the circle. I felt my cheeks heat, not from shame at where I came from, but from the realization that they weren't even curious. They had already decided what my voice was worth. He didn't stop there. He flipped through a few pages, not reading but glancing, performing disinterest with the skill of someone who had wielded power too long. "You know, my dear, literature is not charity. We're not in the business of handing out contracts simply to fill quotas. The Kingsley Review has standards." His emphasis on the word quotas was like a knife twisted in the air, the implication unmistakable. Every laugh that followed was a nail hammered into the coffin of my composure. I wanted to shout, to remind them that I had spent years researching, writing, and editing, that my book had already gained traction with small literary circles online, that my words mattered even if my accent carried the weight of the South. But in that moment, standing under the chandeliers with their crystal drops refracting light into fragments, I felt small, my voice drowned by the tide of ridicule. "Perhaps," Kingsley said, handing back the manuscript as if discarding a napkin. One day you'll learn that real literature isn't about shouting into the void. It's about craft, legacy, pedigree. Unfortunately, those aren't things one can acquire overnight. The circle erupted in polite laughter again, their smiles tight and complicit, their eyes glancing at me like I was a curiosity rather than a peer. I clutched the manuscript to my chest, nodding as though I had received a lesson rather than an insult, and murmured a thank you that tasted like ash on my tongue. I left the ballroom soon after, slipping past waiters with silver trays and clusters of critics still trading gossip like currency. Outside, the night air was cool against my flushed skin, the city's neon glow washing away the guilt of the hall behind me. I walked for blocks without knowing where I was headed, the rhythm of my heels on the pavement pounding like a heartbeat out of sync. Every word he had spoken replayed in my mind, each syllable heavy with the weight of dismissal. But beneath the humiliation, something else stirred, something stubborn, fiery, and unyielding. Because while Kingsley had laughed, I had seen something flicker in his eyes when he glanced at the first page of my manuscript. It had been brief, so brief I almost doubted it, but it was there, a pause, a tightening around the corners of his mouth, the faintest hint of recognition. He had seen something, and it frightened him enough to smother it in laughter. That realization hardened inside me like steel. Let him laugh, I thought, gripping my manuscript tighter. Let him dismiss me. One day, his laughter would echo back at him, and when it did, he would understand that the very voice he tried to silence was the one that would rise loudest. The thing about humiliation is that it lingers, like smoke after a fire. You think you've cleared it away, but hours, days, even months later you catch a trace of it in your lungs, and it reminds you of the night you nearly drowned in other people's laughter. For me, that smoke turned into fuel. I went home from that gala, manuscript clutched like a wound that wouldn't close, and I made myself a promise that I would never again beg men like Edward Kingsley for permission to exist in the literary world. I revised my book until dawn, line by line, sentence by sentence, cutting and carving with a ruthlessness born of rage. By the time the sun rose over the city, I had transformed the manuscript into something sharper, leaner, undeniable. My friends, young poets, essayists, and activists who lived crammed into tiny apartments like mine, encouraged me to take it directly to the people instead of waiting for an outdated gatekeeper to deem it worthy. So I uploaded chapters online, serialized them on a blog, and promoted them through grassroots networks of Black writers and readers who knew what it was to be ignored. At first, it was a trickle, 10 readers here, a share there, but then came the first viral essay, Roots of Tomorrow, Why Our Past Still Breathes in Us. And suddenly my words were everywhere. Students posted passages on TikTok, professors emailed me asking for permission to assign it, and book clubs from Atlanta to Los Angeles tore into the chapters with the kind of hunger I had only ever dreamed of. Within 3 months, my blog had millions of views, and a small but fearless independent publisher, run by 2 Black women who had built their company out of a basement in Brooklyn, offered me a contract not out of charity, but out of recognition that my book had already proven its worth. When Roots of Tomorrow hit the shelves, it spread like wildfire. Newspapers called it a cultural lightning bolt, while readers called it something even more precious, truth. The sales shocked everyone but me, because I had felt the tremor of it long before the reviews came. The way my inbox filled with stories from readers who said they saw themselves reflected for the first time. The way young Black girls lined up at community centers for signed copies. The way immigrant mothers clutched the book to their chests as if it held part of their own story. The bestseller list couldn't deny it. Within 2 weeks, I was climbing, and within 2 months, I was at the top. Invitations poured in for speaking engagements, television interviews, and panels where suddenly my Southern accent wasn't a source of ridicule, but a badge of authenticity, a rhythm that grounded my words in lived experience. Every headline seemed to echo the same theme, a voice that cannot be silenced. And while I was rising, Kingsley was falling. I didn't notice it at first. I was too busy riding trains across the country for book tours, too busy answering letters from high school students who said my book had convinced them to write, too busy breathing in the air of finally being seen. But the murmurs reached me eventually. The Kingsley Review was losing relevance. clinging to the same circle of elitist critics who wrote for each other rather than for readers, while the world outside demanded stories that felt alive, urgent, and inclusive. Subscription numbers plummeted, advertisers began withdrawing, and younger writers, voices that should have kept the magazine fresh, stopped submitting altogether, tired of being told they didn't fit the pedigree. The irony was almost too perfect. The man who had once mocked me for being a blogger with delusions now found his magazine mocked for being dusty, out of touch, and irrelevant. I remember sitting in a Chicago hotel room during my tour, watching a news segment where analysts discussed whether the Kingsley Review could survive the digital age, and one critic said flatly, "They've ignored the voices that matter. They're crumbling under the weight of their own arrogance." I laughed out loud, not because his downfall alone pleased me, but because I could feel the tide turning, proof that the stories people once dismissed as marginal were in fact central to the future. Meanwhile, the cracks in Kingsley's empire widened into fractures. A former intern published an exposé describing years of harassment and condescension under his watch. Several staff resigned in protest, and whispers of lawsuits reached the press. Advertisers fled in droves, unwilling to attach their brands to a sinking ship. And through it all, his scornful words from that night at the gala echoed in my mind. "Literature is not charity," he had said, and I realized how right he had been. My success had nothing to do with charity. It had everything to do with truth. As my book entered its 8th month on the bestseller list, a professor at Columbia told me something that stuck. "Danielle, what you've done isn't just write a book. You've shifted the conversation. You've made literature accountable again." That struck me as ironic, because Kingsley had built his career on claiming to hold literature accountable to tradition. Yet here I was, a woman he had ridiculed, rewriting the definition of tradition itself. Invitations arrived to speak at universities Kingsley once used as recruiting grounds, and I accepted every single one, not out of pettiness, but because I knew there were students in those halls who needed to hear my story. On stage, I spoke with a confidence I hadn't known I possessed, my words rolling out with the cadence of someone who had been told no so many times that she turned rejection into fuel. And everywhere I went, people carried my book like a torch in the dark. I began to notice something else, too. The silence from the Kingsley Review. Not a single review of my book in their pages, not even a dismissive mention. It was as though they believed ignoring me would erase my success. But absence speaks as loudly as words, and readers saw through it. Online forums buzzed with accusations that Kingsley's magazine was out of touch, stuck in an ivory tower while the world moved on. Sponsors pulled back further. The old guard's fortress was crumbling, and at the center of it stood the man who had once smirked at me like I was a joke. I didn't have to lift a finger to make it happen. All I had to do was keep writing, keep telling the truth, and the contrast between us did the work. The day my publisher called to say that Oprah's team wanted my book for her reading list, I cried, not just for myself, but for every person who had been told they didn't belong in a room like that ballroom. And somewhere across the city, I imagined Edward Kingsley pouring himself another glass of scotch, staring at balance sheets that spelled out the slow death of his empire, perhaps finally beginning to realize the cost of dismissing a voice that refused to stay silent. It was almost poetic, really, the way the wheel of fortune swung back around, carrying Edward Kingsley's name not on the glossy cover of Cultural Relevance, but splattered across the headlines of scandal, decline, and desperation. I remember the morning I received his email. Its subject line a single word, help, and for a long moment I just stared at it on my laptop screen, my coffee going cold in my hand. Because here was the same man who had once smirked at me in a ballroom and made sport of my ambition, now reduced to a plea that sounded less like the voice of a publishing titan and more like the cry of someone drowning. He had no choice, of course. By then the Kingsley Review was weeks away from bankruptcy, its advertisers gone, its subscribers bled dry, its staff disillusioned and leaving in droves. Lawsuits had piled up, accusing him of fostering a toxic environment, of burying harassment complaints, of holding back writers who didn't fit his narrow idea of pedigree. And in the middle of it all, while he scrambled to hold his empire together, the very audience he had mocked me in front of was watching me soar. My book still sitting atop bestseller lists, my voice in every corner of media, my face on magazine covers that once reserved their space only for people like him. So when he asked to meet in person, I agreed, not out of sympathy, but out of something deeper, a sense that the time had finally come to settle the imbalance that had hung in the air since the night he first dismissed me. We met in his office, once the grand beating heart of literary elitism, now looking strangely diminished with half-empty shelves and papers stacked like barricades against failure. He had aged in the months since the gala. The sharpness of his features had softened into weariness, and his eyes carried the look of someone who had been cornered by inevitability. "Danielle," he said, voice gravelly, "I was wrong about you." The admission, small and heavy, landed between us like an overdue debt. I sat across from him, spine straight, my manuscript turned bestseller resting in my bag like a reminder of every door he had once tried to close, and I let the silence stretch until his discomfort became palpable. Finally, I told him what I had known from the very beginning, that my voice didn't need his permission, that it had thrived without his approval, and that if he wanted me to save his magazine, it would be on my terms and mine alone. He nodded, desperate enough not to argue, and slid a folder across the desk. A proposal for me to take over as editor-in-chief, to rebuild the magazine's credibility from the ground up. I almost laughed at the irony. The same man who had once declared his publication too prestigious to waste on charity, now asking me, the woman he ridiculed, to carry it into the future. But I didn't laugh, because this wasn't a joke. It was an opportunity to carve something new out of the ruins of the old. I agreed, but with conditions so clear and uncompromising that he flinched when I listed them. A complete restructuring of staff to prioritize diversity and inclusion, a permanent board seat for me, with full decision-making power, funding dedicated to elevating marginalized voices, and most importantly, public accountability. He would stand beside me at a press conference and acknowledge the magazine's failures before handing me the reins. To my surprise, he didn't resist. Perhaps he couldn't. Perhaps he knew that fighting would only accelerate his downfall. But either way, he sighed. The press conference was surreal, held in the same hall where months earlier he had mocked me under chandeliers. Now the cameras flashed for me, the microphones tilted toward me, and Kingsley stood beside me, diminished and hollow, as I announced the magazine's rebirth. I spoke not just for myself, but for every writer who had been told they didn't belong, every story shoved aside because it didn't fit into the narrow confines of tradition. Literature, I said into the sea of cameras, is not a fortress to be guarded by gatekeepers. It is a bridge, built stronger when more voices are allowed to cross. The applause that followed was not for Kingsley, but for the possibility of a new future, and I felt in that moment the balance shift irrevocably. Over the following months, I transformed the Kingsley Review into something entirely different, hiring editors from backgrounds that had never before been represented in its pages, publishing stories that spoke to the raw realities of our time rather than the comfortable nostalgia of the elite, opening its doors to readers who had long since turned away in disgust. Slowly, subscriptions began to rise again, not because of the name on the masthead, but because of the voices inside its pages. Kingsley faded into the background, reduced to a ceremonial title, a relic of an era that had ended. At board meetings, he no longer commanded the room. He sat in silence while I led discussions, my vision steering the publication into waters he had been too blind to chart. The transformation wasn't easy. There was pushback, criticism from old guard critics who sneered that I was turning literature into activism. But the results spoke louder than their protests. Sales grew, readership expanded, and, most importantly, the magazine finally mattered again. And I mattered, not because he had given me permission, but because I had taken back the very power he once tried to deny me. I often think back to that night at the gala, the laughter echoing off marble, the sting of humiliation burning in my chest, and I realize now that it was the best gift Kingsley could have given me. Without that wound, I might never have fought as hard, never have sharpened my voice until it cut through the noise. He ridiculed me to protect a dying system, but in the end, I saved him by building a future. The Kingsley Review no longer bore the weight of his name. It bore the weight of our collective voices, the ones silenced for too long. And as I walked past the magazine's new lobby, redesigned with murals of diverse authors and quotes from writers across generations, I understood something simple and profound. Revenge had never been the point. Vindication had. And I had found it, not in his downfall, but in our rise.